Giancarlo woke up again from unconsciousness for the second time that week. The escape pod luckily had held together during re-entry. The restraining belt on the tiny crash seat, obviously designed for humans, had not. He gathered what supplies he could and stepped out tentatively into the swampy landscape his craft had landed in. It wasn't normal for a Wookie to feel afraid, but this wasn't exactly a normal situation. Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. This is part 2 of what would happen if the First Order invaded Earth. In the last episode, a giant cloud of unidentified objects crossed paths with Sol 3, depositing hundreds of thousands of heavily armed aliens across the planet's surface. Earth is woefully unprepared to handle the situation. The asteroids were all supposed to burn up in our atmosphere. The scientists had said none of the objects were large enough to survive. But of course that hadn't happened. At the last possible moment, all the asteroids began slowing down and adjusting their speed for a safe descent. This was detected only a few hours before impact, hardly enough time to map out all the potential landing zones, let alone warn the public and send out the proper people to quarantine the areas. And therefore, first contact was carried out by Texan farmhands, Tibetan monks, and Sri Lankan jewelers. It was a mess. And early reports indicated that all these aliens were heavily armed with weapons much more advanced than our own, and they all exhibited extremely aggressive behavior. Worse, the aliens began grouping together and forming small armies. Many countries' law enforcement agencies found themselves overwhelmed and unable to contain the chaos, and governments began deploying military and militia groups to counter the growing threat. General Hux eagerly awaited the reports from the launch. It had been a brilliant idea to bring the Bakura Imperial Prison into the plan. Without the resources required to carry out a full invasion, the First Order were in the process of creating a situation where they would be welcomed as saviors instead. Early reports indicated that more than 70% of the prisoners were still active and seeking out others to create small units of pure chaos. More importantly, the world's governments were fully occupied in dealing with this incursion. Some of the less stable governments were already on the brink of collapse. The prisoners were doing their job all right. In some cases, they were doing their job too well. Giancarlo had been wandering aimlessly for most of the day now, until suddenly something triggered in his mind. It was as if his instincts had taken a life of its own, and was now driving him towards a specific destination. He came upon a clearing with a small house and some kind of primitive land crawler parked in front. Something was off. Giancarlo's many years as a warrior and a freedom fighter had honed his battle instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him to take cover. The Wookie crouched and carefully made his way towards the edge of the clearing. Having been in the forest for several hours now, he had gotten used to the sounds of the wildlife and the different smells. He had a baseline for what was normal, but right now he smelt and heard something that was far from normal, yet at the same time oddly familiar. Suddenly, there was a staccato of banging noises coming from the house. Invisible projectiles peppered the tree line across from Giancarlo. Something from within the forest returned fire with blaster bolts, which thudded against the house. Then a small metal sphere was thrown into the house. There was a large concussive boom, and then everything fell silent. 3 heavily armed Trandoshans emerged from the woods. Giancarlo instinctively grabbed onto his bowcaster and brought it up to firing position and took aim. The United States had fared better than most countries. In the last few decades, in response to terrorism, America's police force had become heavily militarized and were quite capable at hunting down the alien fighters and preventing them from grouping into larger fighting forces. On top of that, the populace was the most heavily armed in the world. At first, this proved to be a blessing and helped the United States quickly gain the upper hand. But once it was apparent that the United States had the situation under control, the government began feeling uneasy. Well-armed militia groups were popping up across the country, filling in gaps where law enforcement and military couldn't be, and they answered to no one but themselves. The president and his cabinet had been removed from D.C. to a bunker into an undisclosed location. There, he was in constant talks with other world leaders. The United States had established an information network, and the majority of the world, with few exceptions, had agreed to join and share whatever information and intel they could about this alien threat. So far, the world's top analysts and scientists were stumped. The aliens had no clear command chain, and any attempts at negotiation were met with hostility. Without understanding why the aliens were here, the top leaders of the world prepared for the worst. There were 2 major theories circulated by the international community. One was that this was the first wave of a larger invasion. But there are many holes in this theory. Why were their landing zones so spread out? Where was their air cover? Where were their support vehicles? It just didn't make tactical sense. This didn't seem like an invasion. Others suggested that these aliens were survivors of some catastrophe, like a shipwreck. But then, why were they all heavily armed and unwilling to communicate? The few aliens that were captured all died in captivity within hours and went brain dead. This confused scientists even more. Were these aliens a hive mind species? It seemed impossible though. These aliens came from at least a dozen different species and had varying levels of combat expertise and tactical knowledge. There's no doubt that these were individuals. And despite the fact that many of these aliens were grouping together, there was still no discernible pattern in their attack. For now, besides containing the threat, figuring out why these aliens were here was top priority. Borsk smelled the Wookiee before he saw him on the edge of the clearing. In unison, he and his Trandoshan comrades lifted their blasters to meet the Wookiee's bowcaster. But as soon as he reached firing position, a splitting pain drove Borsk down to his knees. It was as if someone had launched 1,000 needles into his brain and into the back of his eyes. His blaster dropped uselessly to the floor. The Wookiee roared and his shot went wide and hit a tree above the Trandoshans, who were all now sprawled on the ground. Out of the corner of his eye, Borsk watched the Wookiee approach them. Paralyzed with pain, he was helpless to stop the slaughter that was about to be inflicted upon him. The Wookiee was right over Borsk now. The Trandoshan braced himself for the pain that was sure to come. But the furry beast walked right past them and into the house. There was a pause and then several loud shots from a bowcaster, followed by a blood-curdling yell from the Wookiee. Ernie first started serving his country when he was 18, and he'd been fighting the good fight ever since. It gave him purpose. A purpose that replaced any need for a family or companionship. While people used to commend him for his service, ever since he left the military and police force, he'd been branded by his neighbors and the local lawman as a vigilante. That's what they called people who cared nowadays. All Ernie ever heard anymore was, "You're too old, let someone else handle it," or "Ernie, you're paranoid." But Ernie knew he was onto something. There was a new group of kids in town, much more serious and dangerous than your average juveniles. He could tell that these kids were organized, almost as if they were a part of an insurgency. Ernie would know about these sort of things. He had more than a dozen LARP missions under his belt in Nam, and these kids reminded him of the Kong. They were running around creating safe houses and stockpiling what he suspected were weapons. He told the local police about this threat, but they just laughed at him. They told him that they were probably just listening to music and feeling bad for themselves in a safe, judgment-free group setting. But Ernie knew better. He had been a cop in upstate New York for more than 3 decades, cleaning out heroin dens and hippie squatters. No, these kids were up to something. Drug addicts and hippies didn't post spotters and guards outside of their hangouts 24/7. He might have been old, but he had more than half a century's worth of experience underneath his belt. Quickly, he dispatched the lookout outside the abandoned building and headed inside. On the walls, the words "Black Parade" had been scribbled numerous times. Apparently, it was where these kids thought they would go after they died. The inside of the building was pitch black, and Ernie felt his way through the debris that lined the floor. All of a sudden, a light turned on, and he found himself standing in a room stockpiled with giant barrels of what seemed to be chemicals. Ernie felt a blow hit his back, followed by a warm fluid trickling down his spine. His legs began to buckle, and he embraced the darkness. Well guys, that's where we're going to leave off today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of this series. A few weeks ago, I joined my first ever podcast with the fun folks over at War of the Stars. We discussed whether we thought the Empire was truly evil or not. Click here if you guys want to check that out. Thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.